Walk into any German supermarket and you're guaranteed to find this, Spezi. Not one version, not two, an entire section. And in case Spezi is new to you, let me introduce you. This is Coca-Cola and this is Fanta. Mix them together and you get Spezi. Look, I know it sounds like some viral trend, but trust me, it's not. In Germany, this is a cultural institution. People who grew up here, including me, have been drinking Spezi since childhood. Almost 40% of all German households purchase a cola orange mix like this at least once a year, and there are plenty to choose from. Because it tastes incredible. I would even argue it tastes better than either of these on their own. But that simplicity also creates a very strange question. How did a drink this cheap, simple, and easy to copy become a German cultural icon? Who or what even started this? So I went looking for answers, and it turns out that this humble German habit of mixing cola with orange soda reveals something much bigger. Germany's deeply rooted culture of mixed drinks. A fierce battle over who owns the Spezi name, and a 50-year-old deal worth millions. And last but not least, what happens when the German beer industry realizes that its future may depend on something entirely different? So today, let's crack open the surprisingly spicy story of Spezi. Let's begin our investigation with the most important clue. This right here is currently Germany's best-selling Spezi brand. And it's made by Paulaner, a brand known around the world not for soft drinks, but for beer and a somewhat Disney-fied version of Bavaria and its beer gardens. Most German soft drinks come in bottles like these. It's PET plastic or transparent glass. But Paulaner Spezi does not. It comes in a beer bottle. It's brown, it has this typical shape, and it comes with a crown cap. And that's not a gimmick, it's more of a piece of evidence. Because the story of Spezi does not begin inside Coca-Cola headquarters. It begins in beer gardens, taverns, and guest houses. Places built around beer or wine, often serving food where entire families might spend a couple of hours together. And hey, despite the name, a beer garden is actually not only for people who want to drink beer. There are children, there are designated drivers, pregnant women, people on road trips, oh, and plenty of ordinary folks who simply don't want to get hammered at lunch. What do these people order? Well, Germany developed a very specific way of filling this gap. You take something strong, heavy, sweet, or intensely flavored, and you mix it with something else to make it lighter, longer, and easier to drink. And this is actually so common that the new mixture then becomes familiar enough to turn into a drink of its own. The most widespread example, I would say, is Schorle. Let's quickly explain Schorle. So Germany was at the heart of the world's first major sparkling water craze back in the 18th century. This 150-year-old carafe is proof actually. That's what they used to ship naturally sparkling German spring water around the world. I made a whole fascinating video about this, which you should watch right after this one. And Germans have remained deeply committed to sparkling water ever since. We're actually the world's biggest market by far. We drink it both on its own and mixed with other things. Take a glass of wine, for example. Now mix it with ice-cold sparkling water and you get Weinschorle. I really like it actually. It keeps the character of the wine, but it makes it lighter, colder, and much easier to drink on a warm afternoon. Or you could mix fruit juice with sparkling water and you get Saftschorle. Saft just means juice, and this is a rhubarb juice, my favorite example, because it tastes kind of, intense on its own, but mixed with cold water, sparkling like that. And the most famous version of Schorle, Apfelschorle, made with apple juice, is sold pre-bottled across the entire country by many, many different brands. We don't even think of this as diluted apple juice, it's just Apfelschorle. Even beer culture follows a similar logic. According to a famous story, a Bavarian innkeeper who was running short on beer mixed it with lemonade for a crowd of thirsty cyclists. Et voilà, Radler, literally meaning cyclist, was born. The story is probably a legend, but for roughly 100 years, this has been increasingly popular in Germany for people who want something, between beer and soda. Very refreshing. Oh, and guess what? You can also buy it pre-bottled. Beer mixes like this come in many, many flavors these days. You don't even have to mix your own. You get the idea, right? We take familiar drinks and we adjust them for a different moment, a different setting, or a different kind of drinker. They are practical, refreshing drinks with their own purpose. And once they get popular enough, they get a name strong enough to stand on its own. And that matters because Spezi comes from this tradition. Before it became a name on a bottle, cola and orange soda was already in order. Coca-Cola had been sold in Germany since the early 20th century, so that wasn't new. And during the shortages of the Second World War, its German operation created the original version of Fanta, believe it or not. A strange story I also explored in an entire previous video. I'll link all of them below. But the orange Fanta most people would recognize today arrived in Germany during the 1950s, and it came in a bottle like this. And so when this new orange soda entered a country with a deeply established habit of mixing drinks, the next step was basically inevitable. Somebody poured it into cola, and then somebody else did the same thing. Maybe they wanted less caffeine, or maybe they wanted something fruitier and lighter than Coke. Or somebody was just using up leftovers, I don't know. But what we do know is that it really does taste good and kind of like its own drink, not just a mix. By the early 1960s, the combo appears to have been spreading through pubs and restaurants, particularly in Bavaria down south. So the real commercial opportunity was never discovering the flavor. The opportunity was recognizing that the same tiny request was being made again and again across beer gardens, taverns, restaurants, and guest houses throughout the region. All that remained was for somebody to give it a name and put it in a bottle. The company that spotted the opportunity was Riegele, a family-run brewery from the city of Augsburg. Orders for cola orange mixes were growing rapidly, and while most breweries thought producing a soft drink would be beneath them, Riegele did not. So they made a bold move and released not Spezi, but this, Spezial KM. KM being short for cola mix, so essentially a special mixed cola. And just to be clear from the start, Riegele was not literally mixing bottles of Coca-Cola and Fanta. They did develop their own recipe, of course. But essentially this is what Spezial KM was. As for the name, Riegele had actually owned the trademark Spezi since the 1950s. It was originally registered for a beer they were making, not a soda. But the name was actually really strong. Spezi was a local Bavarian word for a good friend, a pal, a special companion. Riegele even promoted the original brand with the copyrighted slogan, "Ein Spezi muss dabei sein." Rough translation, a Spezi should always come along, which was the perfect brand name for a drink born in places where people sit together for hours with friends at long communal tables. Like, that is solid branding. But as first test runs of Spezial KM began outselling the Spezi beer they were making and catching on with customers, an obvious idea emerged. Why not give the far simpler and catchier Spezi name to the drink people actually wanted? Riegele's breakthrough was as simple as it was brilliant. Don't invent a new flavor, just bottle the habit. So in 1965, Riegele went big. It discontinued the Spezi beer and started selling its successful cola orange drink under the catchy name it already owned. Spezi, as we know it, was born, but crucially, its brewery origins remained very visible. The first Spezi came in a standard half-liter beer bottle like this. And check this out. They even explicitly write here that this is for teenagers, athletes, and drivers. But the beer bottle was not actually an aesthetic choice. I would say it may have been the key detail that made the entire business possible. Spezi could travel through an entire system Riegele already possessed. Bottling equipment designed for beer bottles, a deposit system built to collect and reuse those bottles, crates that already fit those bottles, and delivery truck that already carried those crates. And of course, long-established relationships with pubs, taverns, and beer gardens. And that's exactly where customers were already asking for the product. The genius thing is that Riegele didn't need to defeat Coca-Cola in the supermarket. They could just enter through the side door, the existing infrastructure of German beer culture. At last, that popular cola orange mixed drink came in a bottle that looked like all the others, and on it, in big letters, Spezi. The brand was perfectly at home in a beer garden because, in a practical sense, it had belonged there before the product was even launched. And now that the habit had a proper name, people wanted more of it. Everywhere. We're gonna get to the real juicy stuff after a quick word from this video's sponsor. When I travel for food, I love being spontaneous. I'll explore a new neighborhood, I'll find a new random restaurant, I'll look up the dishes, I use maps or translations, maybe I'll even message a friend. And all of these things that make traveling fun for me only work if my phone has data. Without it, I'm completely lost. And that's why I started using Holafly for every trip I go on. Holafly is basically a digital SIM card, an eSIM. I installed it on my phone once, which took about 2 minutes. Now I have real unlimited data area without me buying or swapping out a physical card. They cover like 200 destinations. And the new part that actually got me is something called Always On. Holafly automatically gives you extra backup data every month. It works in tons and tons of destinations, so you're never fully cut off wherever you happen to be. There are no hidden costs, but there is 24/7 support from real people if something happens to go wrong. If you want to try it, there's 5% off eSIMs, there's 10% off Holafly plans for your first 12 months. Just be sure to use my code Andong at checkout, and there's a link in the description below as always. Thank you Holafly for sponsoring this video. It's around 1970 and this is where the first major wave begins. Spezi was no longer just a local solution for a few Augsburg beer gardens. It was becoming a recognizable product. But popularity created a new problem. Scale. Soft drinks are heavy, glass bottles are expensive to transport. Sending full crates across an entire country and then collecting and returning the empty bottles quickly becomes a logistical nightmare, especially for a family-run local brewery. So Riegele didn't even attempt to manufacture every bottle in one enormous central factory. Instead, it turned to a system German breweries already understood extremely well: regional production. Riegele licensed Spezi to partner breweries around the country. Each partner produced and distributed the drink locally under the same shared name. The recipe and brand could travel, the bottles didn't have to. In 1977, this network was formalized as the Spezi Markengetränkeverband, a federation of independent regional bottlers operating under one brand. What I have here is actually an original glass, presumably from 1987, celebrating 10 years of this federation with a special edition glass. I gotta say, the federation was an elegant solution. The same brewery infrastructure that had helped the drink succeed locally at first could now reproduce that success across Germany. I think this new, more ambitious goal could also explain why they eventually switched to a new bottle and crate design that looked a lot more like a regular soft drink. I guess the good old beer bottle had served its original purpose. But there's also an even clearer sign that the idea had escaped Augsburg. It did not take very long until the world's biggest soda companies began copying it. During the late 60s and 70s, Pepsi's German operation introduced Schwipschwap and Coca-Cola launched Mezzomix. These companies had cola, they had orange soda, they also had enormous factories, national distribution networks, and advertising budgets Riegele could only dream of. But there was one thing they didn't have: the name Spezi. That belonged to Riegele and its partners. That's why Coca-Cola and Pepsi were forced to invent their own names for essentially the exact same type of drink, which Riegele, I believe, was thoroughly enjoying. They fought back with campaigns emphasizing that only their product was the original Spezi. It was all over their advertising and it was even on the bottle itself. Which of course created a wonderful irony, considering that Spezi started as a Cola-Fanta mix. And although the soda giants eventually ended up outselling Riegele's Spezi by volume in the 80s or 90s, their brand names, they still sounded like knockoffs. All hardcore Spezi fans knew and loved the original Riegele Spezi, which always kept a loyal following. Worse still, every dollar Big Soda poured into advertising Mezzomix and Schwipschwap probably just helped grow the entire Spezi market around a name neither company actually owned. Either way, Spezi had completed its first transformation, from an informal custom order to a major national category. You might think this would leave Riegele as the happy little family brewery that outsmarted the global giants. But not quite, because there was one major exception to Riegele's control over the name. Let's rewind back to the 70s for a moment, where Spezi was a growing regional curiosity that was only beginning to build a national profile. Yes, competitors were starting to move in, but it was actually not just the global giants. One of Bavaria's most powerful breweries decided it wanted in on the action. Enter Paulaner, a true heavyweight of Munich beer culture. It had its own Oktoberfest tents, a very famous beer garden presence, and guess what? Paulaner did not want to miss out on selling its own cola orange drink. But unlike Big Soda, it insisted on doing it under the name that, as we know, had already become deeply ingrained: Spezi. Which created a problem. Yes, Riegele had registered the trademark, but the trademark was actually so strong that in everyday German, Spezi was already beginning to sound less like one company's product and more like the generic word for cola mixed with orange lemonade. Paulaner had good lawyers who were ready to argue that no single company should be allowed to control a broad term like that exclusively. Riegele, of course, was outraged, but fighting back in court was expensive, time-consuming, and dangerous for both sides. If Riegele lost, other competitors would follow. Its trademark advantage in the growing Spezi market could disappear for good. Paulaner, meanwhile, risked being permanently barred from using the Spezi name, which would be quite the humiliation on their home turf. So in 1974, they made a quiet deal. Paulaner paid Riegele a one-time sum of 10,000 Deutsche Mark. In exchange, Paulaner received the right to sell its own Paulaner Spezi, provided it used its own branding, distinct from Riegele's version. And just for context, 10,000 Deutsche Mark would be roughly equivalent to perhaps 20 or 25,000 bucks today, depending on how you count. So it's not nothing, but hardly a fortune. And back then, it probably felt reasonable. You know, a quick, pragmatic solution to a potentially ugly trademark dispute. And for what it's worth, for the first few decades, the arrangement appeared to work. Coke and Pepsi's drinks dominated mass market shelves, Riegele remained the nostalgic original with a loyal fan base, and Paulaner was a minor player, mostly happy to locally sell its version on its own turf. This is roughly where we had left off. Spezi had established itself nationally, all players had found their positions, and for a while, nothing fundamental changed. In the early 2000s, Germany had more or less reached what looked like peak Spezi. Everyone knew what it was, but it had simply stopped feeling like a story that was still moving. The first wave had crested. But then something changed, not inside the soft drink industry, but inside the world that had created Spezi in the first place. German beer entered a crisis. It's the 2010s, and Germany's beer market had been slowly shrinking for decades, especially among younger consumers. In 1994, Germans were drinking around 107 million hectoliters of beer, and by 2024, that had fallen to just 68 million. Especially all those kids, they were just drinking less alcohol. I'm making fun of it here, but dozens of breweries were actually closing every year. And these guys, Paulaner, they read the room. Their entire business model wasn't just not growing, it was actually built around the product fewer and fewer people were buying. As the panic kept rising, they began desperately searching for a lifeline. Until they realized they were already sitting on one. A drink with a household name, born in beer gardens, with a baked-in loyal following, and thanks to that strange 1974 agreement, a brand name Paulaner had exclusive access to without paying ongoing royalties. And this was key, because regardless of which brand people were actually buying, Germans would often still call the whole category Spezi. Not Schwipschwap, definitely not Mezzo Mix. In the end, they're all just Spezi. And there is Paulaner, who had the only permanent exception to call it that, next to Riegele, of course. As a soft drink, Spezi could also be produced a lot more quickly and sold more profitably than beer. It could also be placed directly onto trucks that were already delivering Paulaner beer crates to supermarkets, pubs, restaurants, and beer gardens across Germany. Wait, that strategy, it sounds kind of familiar, only now on a much bigger scale. Remember how that original 1974 agreement explicitly required Paulaner to use this distinct branding? And no major changes to the branding were allowed. It's probably why no fancy agency was ever asked to create a tasteful modern rebrand of this. We all know too well how those rebrands usually go. That agreement is why Paulaner Spezi still looks the way it does, including a tiny little remark on the side pointing to the license they hold since 1974. The design is kind of flashy and from today's point of view, maybe outdated slightly, or just a little bit ironic maybe? Either way, pretty memorable, almost classic. The branding feels like something that has been sitting in grocery store shelves for decades unchanged, which honestly feels kinda good in a quickly changing world. And fascinatingly, it's this exact look that seemed to have hit a spot with younger consumers looking for non-alcoholic options. By the mid-2010s, Paulaner Spezi was already growing pretty fast without the company ever having done very much. It had its southern German base, it had a little genuine cult momentum, and it was benefiting from an organic movement away from alcoholic drinks. You could almost say the second wave had already started, but quietly. People were already moving toward the product before Paulaner fully understood what it had. Until one fine day in 2019, they finally realized that with Spezi they were not sitting on a side hustle, they were sitting on their future. And they decided to go all in. This is where the second wave stops being accidental. The brewery expanded distribution and pushed the product and its loud, recognizable visual identity everywhere. But instead of marketing it like beer, Paulaner began placing Spezi where young consumers actually were. Sneaker shops, billboards, branded basketball courts, social media flooded with paid and unpaid endorsements. And of course, Spezi Zero, since sugar-free sodas were growing like crazy. The bold colors, the curved waves, the retro vibe, the distinctive beer bottle which Paulaner, unlike Riegele, had actually kept. Paulaner was attempting to fully take over the modern image of Spezi. The drink was no longer just a nostalgic relic of Germany in the 80s, it was being recast as something young, urban, and current. And by 2023, Paulaner did not just leave Riegele behind, it actually overtook its big soda rivals as well. Today, it sells far more than any of its competitors ever did. For many young Germans, Paulaner Spezi had simply become the Spezi. Some have never even heard of the older original version. All of this was a genuine second wave, a mature category suddenly finding an entirely new ceiling. And let me remind you, this entire phenomenon grew from a one-time payment of 10,000 Deutsche Mark in 1974. Imagine being the person who signed off on that agreement. And speaking of which, what has Riegele been up to? Well, to be frank, back at Riegele headquarters, things were not exactly feeling great. Over time, the now infamous Paulaner agreement became increasingly uncomfortable. Riegele still owned the Spezi trademark, yet it was Paulaner who were building an empire around it and bringing in millions. The original product was even in danger of looking like the obscure knockoff. Riegele could not take it anymore. They owned the Spezi name after all, and now they wanted control of it back. From Paulaner's perspective, of course, the situation looked completely different. At this point, they had spent nearly 50 years building their own recipe, identity, distribution network, and of course a fan base. I mean, Riegele may have been first, but the modern phenomenon had been built by Paulaner. Eventually, the tension became impossible to contain. In 2021, Riegele moved to cancel the old agreement and replace it with a modern commercial license. To be completely fair, they did have a case, because the original deal was very brief, unusually open-ended, and written for a market that no longer existed. Oh, and this time they wanted considerably more than the 10,000 Deutsche Mark they got last time. Reportedly, they wanted 5 million per year. Suddenly, a dispute both breweries thought they had settled in 1974 was alive again. And yes, the case did eventually go to court. German press was all over it actually. And even though they were fighting over many tiny technicalities, the big underlying question here was this: when one company owns the name, but another legally builds an empire around it, who deserves the value? After an intense dispute over what the original agreement actually meant, the Munich Regional Court in 2022 eventually sided with, drumroll please, Paulaner. They did it. Sort of. The court ruled that the old agreement stood peaceful coexistence, Riegele still owns the trademark, and only Paulaner retains the right to use it for their Spezi in Germany without paying any new licensing fees. I imagine Riegele must have been pretty pissed. In fact, I know so, because when a bit later another major German beer brand, Krombacher, also entered the market with a competing product called Spezi, that's because Riegele sold them a brand new license for good money. I feel like after losing the court case, this was the best FU move Riegele could still direct at Paulaner. If they can't make them pay more to keep using the brand name, they could at least make money by licensing it to others. All of this remains one of the strangest arrangements in German trademark history. I guess the legal battle was over, or at least it seemed to be, because if you think the Spezi story ends at the German border, think again. This could be relevant for you. There was actually one important limitation in the 1974 agreement between Riegele and Paulaner. It only applied inside Germany. Outside the country, Paulaner did not automatically have the right to use the Spezi name. That's why in the United States, this suspiciously familiar-looking cola orange drink appeared on some store shelves. Paulaner Sunset. And so, as recently as 2025, the bittersweet rivalry between these two Spezi legends actually takes another turn. Get this, Riegele and Paulaner surprisingly buried the hatchet and announced an entirely new international agreement allowing Paulaner to use the Spezi name in selected foreign markets. And no, the United States keeps Paulaner Sunset for now, but for 2026, These two companies planned rollouts under the Paulaner Spezi brand in countries like Switzerland, Spain, Italy, France, Poland. So wherever you are in the world, you may soon be among the lucky people who can find a bottle of Paulaner Spezi in a shop near you. And by the way, this time the financial terms between these two companies remained confidential, but both companies described the agreement as fair and balanced. I feel like this final plot twist is almost elegant, probably as close to a happy ending as the Spezi story was ever gonna get. All the while the national market keeps growing, there are more and more competitors seemingly like every month. Feels like every second German beer brewery is now making their own Spezi, so I think it has a very decent shot at becoming Germany's new national drink. I mean, consider this, the legendary Paulaner brewery brand's best-selling drink is not beer anymore. It's Spezi by a wide margin. And that doesn't mean German beer is about to disappear. But it does reveal where Germany's most famous breweries see growth, youth relevance, and international potential. So if we return to our original questions, who invented Spezi? How did something this simple become a whole thing? The honest answer is that nobody can prove who first mixed cola and orange soda. Mixing drinks is a German national tradition after all. It probably happened independently in countless pubs, restaurants, beer gardens, and private kitchens across Germany. Spezi started as a drink so simple it didn't even need a name. Until it eventually got one, and that name became more valuable than the drink itself. Because once millions of people agree that this mixture is called Spezi, the word begins doing something a simple recipe just can't. It creates expectation, memory, loyalty, nostalgia. And with all of that comes commercial value. Enough commercial value for a world-famous German brewery to build an empire and bet its future on it. That is how Spezi became both a cultural institution and an incredibly valuable business asset. So next time you eventually see a bottle of Spezi near you, remember this. The recipe might take seconds, but the meaning took decades to build. Cheers.